This is part one of the lecture on early Reformed movements in the medieval church. One ongoing problem that has existed throughout church history is the problem of corruption. This is a problem that has existed during the last 2,000 years, and very sadly, it still continues in our own day. At various times, the institutional church has become very rich and very powerful. And when this has happened, the church has attracted or acted as a magnet for all kinds of people. Some people, the good news is that over the years, many men and women have joined the church for very good reasons. And they serve in the church because they love Jesus and because they want to serve others in Jesus's name, and they want to show their gratitude towards God. But the sad thing is that there are others who have joined the church and who serve in the church for wrong reason, for very impure motives, because they wish to gain fame, or they wish to gain riches or power. So this is a problem that has gone on throughout church history. We see this problem mentioned even in literature. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the book, The Canterbury Tales, in the late 1300s. And this book is a collection of stories that give us little windows into life in the Middle Ages. And one of these stories that he wrote in his book, The Canterbury Tales, is the Pardoner's Tale. And this story is about a pardoner, someone who traveled offering forgiveness. And unfortunately, this particular pardoner was a very corrupt pardoner. And so that's what this tale told about. It told about how corrupt this pardoner was. So this is an example of how even literature has highlighted this problem of corruption over the ages. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about monastic corruption. Earlier in this course, we talked about how monasteries began, how men and women would leave ordinary everyday life and maybe go out into the desert or go someplace that was removed from everyday life so that they could devote themselves to God. And these early monasteries started out with very pure motives. However, the sad thing is that by the early 1000s, many of these early monasteries had become corrupt. One reason is because they had become rich and powerful. So what had happened was, over the centuries, many rich and powerful men had given gifts to various monasteries. Sometimes they gave money, sometimes they gave land. Now, some of these men who gave gifts to monasteries did so for the right reason. They were expressing their thanks to God, their gratitude to God, and their love for Jesus. And so they wanted to show their love for Jesus by giving money and land to help his servants as they served the Lord. But unfortunately, other rich and powerful men gave money and land to these monasteries for the wrong reason. Maybe they wanted to gain favor with certain church officials, or maybe they had the mistaken idea that if they gave money or land or other gifts to these monasteries, that they would somehow score points with God. And so these are some of the reasons why people gave money and land to these monasteries. But for whatever reason, men gave money and land to these monasteries, the end result was that these monasteries became rich and powerful. And so because of that, they began to become corrupt. Another practice that developed during the Middle Ages was that some families, which especially rich and noble families, would send one of their sons to serve as monks in these monasteries. There were several reasons why this was a common practice. For one thing, back then, people had larger families than they do today. And so if you had several sons, that meant that when the father died, his lands would be divided among his sons. Now, if you have several generations of sons in the same family, that means each new generation of sons would get smaller and smaller lands when the father died. So perhaps one reason why they would send their sons into to join these monasteries was so that that would mean that the land would be divided among fewer sons because one son was already serving in the monastery. Another possible reason why families would send their sons to serve in the monastery might be because they wanted to have connections with certain powerful church officials, or maybe they had the hope that their own son would one day become a powerful church official. So, and then I'm sure there were families who sent their son to serve in monasteries out of an honest desire to serve God. So there may have been some mixed motives among some of these families, but this was a common practice during the Middle Ages. And whenever a son joined a monastery, their parent would often give a large money gift to the monastery as a way of helping to take care of their son while he served in the church. And so this also added to the wealth and power of these monasteries, so that by the early 1000s, many of these monasteries that had started out pure and very devout, with very devout service to God, had become corrupt. And so in the early 1000s, men in different parts of Europe began to undertake reform movement. They began to try to reform the monastic movement. So let's look at some of these monastic reforms. The first monastic reform I want to talk about is the Cistercian Order. Now, the Cistercian Order was founded in the year 1098, and it was founded by monks who wished to live a more disciplined life. The Cistercian Order was based on the rule of Benedict. Now, Benedict was a monk who lived in earlier centuries, and he developed the Benedictine Order. And when he developed the Benedictine Order, one of the great things he did was he created the rule of Benedict. And the rule of Benedict was a set of rules for the monks in the Benedictine Order to live their lives by. And it was actually a very good rule. And so when the Cistercian Order was founded, the men who were part of the Cistercian Order decided to adopt the rule of Benedict and to live by the rule of Benedict in their own order. Now, the motto of the Cistercian order was pray and work. The Cistercians emphasized ascetic self-denial, simple buildings, and representative organization. Okay, so they emphasized living a simple lifestyle. They built simple buildings. They did not try to decorate them with a lot of decorations because they wanted their devotion towards God to be pure and to not have any distractions. And they practiced representative government within their organization. So it was kind of democratic within their organization. The Cistercian order began with a monastery located in the city of Citeaux, France. Actually, I think the monastery was outside of Citeaux, but that's where the first monastery was built, near Citeaux, France. Now, let me tell you about the most famous Cistercian. The most famous Cistercian was Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux was born into a noble family. He had mystical inclinations. There are different forms of Christianity, and different people have different inclinations in their spiritual lives. Some people are more focused on studying the Bible. Some people are more focused on serving others. And some people are more focused on prayer and cultivating their personal relationship with God. Well, Bernard of Clairvaux had more of a mystical leaning in his life. So he often spent time in prayer, and he wanted to develop a very close relationship with God. He was also forthright in his dealings with others. And he traveled all over Europe preaching sermons, calling men to go on crusade. And so he helped to recruit men for the Second Crusade. So in many ways, the Second Crusade was really motivated in a lot of ways by Bernard of Clairvaux, because he went around Europe preaching the crusade, and he kept calling men to take up the cross and to go to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem for the sake of Christ. And now speaking of the Crusades, that brings me to the military orders. So there were 3 different military orders that were created during the Crusades. One of these was the Templar Knights. The Templar Knights were created during the Crusade around the year 1118. Their original purpose was to provide protection for Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Now, even though Jerusalem at that time was securely in Christian hands after 1099, the rest of the Holy Land was not nearly as safe. And so Christian pilgrims were still in danger of being attacked, being robbed, and even being killed by bandits and others as they passed through Muslim-controlled territories. And so the original headquarters for the Templar Knights was the Temple Mount. And this is why they are known as the Templar Knights, because their original headquarters was at the Temple of the Mount, where the Jewish temple used to be and where Al-Aqsa Mosque is today. Now, the Templar Knights became famous for their military skills, and gradually the Templars moved from their original purpose of providing protection for Christian pilgrims traveling in the Holy Land, and they moved on to active military involvement in fighting against Muslim armies and defending the Crusader states. The Templar Knights became very popular during the Crusades, and so many people donated lots of money to the Templar Knights. I'm not talking about a little, I'm talking about a lot of money. And so because of this, the Templar Knights became very rich, and they eventually became very skilled at managing their finances. And they set up a network of banks throughout Europe and even in the Holy Land. One of the innovations they made in their banks was they allowed pilgrims to deposit their assets in their home countries in one of their bank branches. And then when they arrived in the Holy Land, they were allowed to withdraw money that they had deposited in their home countries. And so this was one of the innovations that Templar Knight banks created. Once the Crusades ended with the fall of Acre in 1291, support for the Templars began to weaken because the Templars were no longer able to fulfill their primary military mission. In addition, the Templars were criticized for their great wealth. By then, the Templars' main headquarters was in Paris. And King Philip IV of France was fighting a war against England at that time, and he was heavy in debt to the Knights Templar. And so he may have been looking for a way to get rid of this debt with the Templars. And so Philip IV, this may have been the reason why Philip IV took advantage of rumors about criminal activities by members of the Templar and launched heavy persecution against the Templars. Many members of the Templar were arrested, including their Grand Master, and under torture, many confessed to numerous crimes, including heresy, worshiping the devil, homosexuality, financial corruption, spitting on the cross, and more. Now, it is highly unlikely that these confessions were true, that many of these confessions were true. But because they had confessed, because they had made these confessions before officers of the law, they were found guilty of these crimes that they had confessed to, and they were executed because of these confessions. And the Pope reluctantly dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312 under pressure from King Philip IV of France. A second military order that I want to talk about are the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Hospitallers were founded in Jerusalem in 1099, and they were officially recognized by the Pope in 1113. The original purpose of the Knights Hospitaller was to provide aid and medical care to Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. Now, they began their mission by supporting the hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. They did not found the hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. It had already been established by other people. But the Knights Hospitaller formed an order, and they began supporting St. John, the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. But gradually over time, they became more and more involved in military activity. First, the first step towards military involvement was providing armed escort for Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. And then later, they became actively involved in the defense of the Crusader states. Now, even though they became increasingly involved in military activities, the Knights Hospitallers never stopped their humanitarian mission. And even today, they still exist. And they exist today as a humanitarian organization. They do a lot to help disadvantaged people. Now, with the fall of Acre in 1291, the Knights Hospitallers fled to the island of Cyprus, and they eventually later relocated to the island of Rhodes, where they remained there from 1310 to 1522. And then still later, they relocated to Malta, where they lived from 1530 to 1798. And like I said, the Knights Hospitallers are still involved in humanitarian work today, including an organization called the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. The last military order I want to talk about is the Teutonic Knights. The Teutonic Knights began in 1190 during the Third Crusade, when they established a field hospital during the siege of Acre. They were formally founded in 1198 by the Pope as a military order. One of the things that distinguished the Teutonic Knights from the other military orders was that the Teutonic Knights was a German military order. So that means that most of the men who were part of the Teutonic Knights were German, they spoke German, and their documents were written in German. So this was a German military order, and that will become important as we talk about their history. The Teutonic Knights held on to land around Acre until the fall of Acre in 1291. But by that time, they were already active in Europe. For example, in 1211, Andrew II of Hungary invited them to come to his kingdom to help defend his kingdom's southeastern borders against neighboring raiders. And so on this map, you can see where Hungary is, and you can see this section of Hungary called Burzenland. And this is where the Teutonic Knights went to help Hungary defend itself against raiders who were attacking Hungary from outside. Now, a year later, but what happened was they did an excellent job of defending Hungary against these raiders, but over time, they began building their own forts, and they began turning Burzenland into a state within Hungary. And so Hungary's king did not like this. And so the Teutonic Knights wore out their welcome in Hungary. And in 1225, the Hungarians expelled them from Hungary. And so a year later, Duke Conrad I of Masovia, in what is present-day Poland, invited the Teutonic Knights to help him defend his borders against the Livonians. So if you look at this map and you look up along the coast of the Baltic Sea, you can see Prussia, and then you see Livonia. So Duke Conrad of Masovia, which was a kingdom that existed at that time, invited the Teutonic Knights to come up to the north and help defend his kingdom against the Livonians. Now, the Livonians were pagans. And so eventually, the Teutonic Knights became involved in what became known as the Baltic Crusades. And this was a prolonged crusade against the pagan peoples who lived in the Baltic area, and in what are now today known as the Baltic states. And the idea was that they were there to bring Christianity to the pagans and to convert the pagans to Christianity. However, the Teutonic Knights did not do this by persuasion. They did not do this by having priests proclaim the gospel to the pagans. Instead, the Teutonic Knights tried to convert these pagans by force, by the sword. And so they would ride into these pagan villages, and they would burn down their homes, kill these people, rape the women. I mean, it was awful. It was bloody. And yet this is how the Teutonic Knights tried to spread the gospel in the Baltic region. Now, this crusade lasted about 3/4 of a century, because it took a long time to pacify these pagans. And so there developed an annual rhythm. So during the spring and summer, those would be the fighting months when the Teutonic Knights went out and they conducted their raids. And then during the fall and winter, they would go back into their winter quarters, and they would recuperate, have R&R, they would enjoy the Christmas holidays, and then when the weather improved the following spring, they would go back to their raiding. And so this took about 75 years or so to complete this crusade. But by 1300, the last pagans in Europe had been forcibly removed. And that ends the first part of this lecture. Please go to part 2 of the history of reform movements in the medieval church.